Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Georgia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the summer of 1906, the small town of Marrows Creek sat half hidden between stretches of pine and red clay roads in central Georgia. It was a quiet place, built on old timber money and long shadows. Locals recalled that the air smelled of iron and damp soil, and at dusk the trees seemed to hold their breath. It was there that Dr. Elias Wren arrived, a man whose name would later appear in county death records, church logs, and whispered recollections that never seemed to agree. According to the Georgia Department of Public Health's early archives, medical supervision in rural areas during that time was scarce, and independent practitioners were often trusted without oversight. Wren's papers claimed study in Savannah and brief service during a yellow fever outbreak, but few could confirm it. He rented the upper floor of a shuttered apothecary and began taking patients by late autumn. Townspeople described him as polite but distant, with a face that seemed carved in calm stone. His eyes, clear and watchful, gave no sign of cruelty nor kindness. The first weeks brought improvement to several feverish farmers and coughing mill children. But by December, an odd new tonic appeared on his shelves, a syrup said to restore strength and cleanse the blood. He called it Tincture No. 7. For 5 cents a dose, it sold faster than quinine. Within a month, fainting fits began. Livestock went unmilked, workers collapsed in fields, and a Sunday sermon ended when 2 parishioners fell before the altar. No one suspected the tonic. Instead, they blamed the cold or bad wells or the curse of the swamp. Wren noted symptoms in his ledger with careful handwriting: blurred vision, trembling, blackness at the tongue. But the pages that followed, at least those recovered, cut off abruptly. Years later, an affidavit from the county coroner's clerk mentioned that the doctor himself appeared unchanged, though the people around him dwindled. In early 1907, the sheriff sealed his shop. Inside, glass bottles labeled Toxic and No 7 sat neatly arranged, their contents thick as tar. The mixture contained morphine, formalin, and traces of arsenic, a combination that could sustain life just long enough to end it. It was a tragedy the state's public health officials, then still forming under Georgia's early sanitary board, could barely document. But it would not end with the closing of that door. The apothecary's doors were nailed shut by spring, but stories seeped through the cracks like the smell of old medicine. Town records list only 17 confirmed deaths, though letters found decades later in the attic of the Marrow family spoke of dozens more: farmhands, children, even a visiting salesman who stopped for a cough tonic and never reached the next town. The church minutes from April 1907 make a single note: Dr. Wren departed suddenly, his effects unclaimed. What followed was silence, weeks of empty roads, boarded windows, and the strange unease that creeps into a place when something poisonous lingers unseen. In June, state inspectors arrived from Macon. Their report, still filed under the Early Public Health Index, later referenced in the History of Public Health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, describes a pervasive odor, dark residues upon jars, and a peculiar greenish cast upon the walls. They concluded the contamination came not from disease, but from deliberate preparation. Yet no warrant was issued. Rural records then were unreliable, and the sheriff's men found no trace of Wren. A few claimed he was seen walking along the Ocmulgee River, coat folded neatly over his arm, but none followed. By autumn, Marrows Creek had thinned to half its population. Families moved west toward Carroll County or north to Atlanta's mills. A merchant named Leland Holt wrote to a friend that the town is turning to dust, and every whisper has his name in it. In 1908, a freight wagon bound for Savannah discovered a crate among its cargo marked Medical Supplies, Wren Company. Inside were bottles identical to those seized the year before. The shipper's address led to an abandoned storefront near the rail line. The ledger there, water-damaged and barely legible, mentioned shipments labeled No. 7,
bound for neighboring towns. Some believe this was proof Wren had built a small
network of distributors under assumed names. Others thought the crate was planted by those who wished the scandal buried. Whatever the truth, the Tonic's formula spread further than the man himself. By 1910, neighboring counties reported a spate of slow, wasting illnesses with symptoms near identical to those recorded at Marrow's Creek. And yet, every new doctor claimed the same thing: malnutrition, bad water, or heat stroke. The official story faded into the paperwork of progress. Only the old townsfolk, those who remembered the smell of the apothecary, spoke of Wren's draft, a phrase muttered by firelight when someone's sickness lingered too long. A local minister later wrote in his memoirs, "He was no killer of intent. He believed his cure was a mercy, and mercy can kill as sure as malice." By 1912, the last surviving relatives of the victims had either left Georgia or refused to speak of the affair. The county clerk, a man named Robert Tilling, filed one final note in the ledgers: "Case suspended, subject unlocated." His handwriting wavered, as if he had written the words reluctantly. Yet rumors persisted that a physician calling himself E. Warren had been seen in Valdosta offering the same tonic under a new label, the revitalizing elixir. Newspapers of the time printed advertisements that mirrored Wren's phrasing almost word for word. The bottles, too, bore a familiar design: dark glass, brass-capped, with etched measurement lines. It was never proven, but even decades later the archivists who contributed to the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, would cite the Wren case as an early warning of unregulated medicine in the rural South. One surviving affidavit from a Valdosta apothecary clerk described a quiet man of medium height, hair graying at the temples, speaking softly, with a doctor's manner. When shown an earlier photograph of Elias Wren, he reportedly said, "Could be, though the eyes seemed emptier." The phrase lingered in the margins of the report. In that same year, a fire broke out in the county courthouse of Marrow's Creek. No one ever determined the cause. All that remained of the medical logs and confiscated bottles was a small iron lockbox retrieved from the ashes, containing a handful of melted glass and a single folded letter addressed to E.W. The ink had run, but the words "Forgive the mixture" could still be read. Following the fire, the town itself changed. The creek that once gave it life grew stagnant, its water tinted with an oily sheen. Locals began to avoid the area, saying the land had soured. A farmer's wife, Mrs. Annetta Cole, wrote in a private diary that her husband had unearthed dozens of small bottles under the soil, each sealed and marked only by numbers. Her entry ends abruptly, with no later mention. By 1915, Marrow's Creek no longer appeared on most maps. The rail depot was dismantled, its platform stripped for lumber. When a traveling photographer passed through that autumn, he captured an image of the empty storefront. Its windows black, the sign barely legible. On the glass, etched faintly from the inside, were the words, "No, 7 still works." Some believed it a prank, others a cruel echo of what had been. In the years that followed, any new doctor arriving in the region found themselves regarded with a strange, distant suspicion. It was as though Wren's ghost, or at least his reputation, still practiced quietly among the pines. The following decade brought silence over Marrow's Creek, as if the land itself refused to recall the man who had drained its faith. But whispers never truly died. In 1920, a surveyor's team sent from Macon to chart the old county lines stumbled upon the remains of Wren's apothecary. Their foreman, Harlan Moats, later filed a statement noting a peculiar preservation of the interior, as though the dust had settled differently inside those walls. He claimed that several bottles still stood upright on the counter, their contents hardened into black resin. When the glass was tapped, a faint metallic sound echoed, not liquid, but something mineral. Among the debris lay a cracked photograph of a man in a physician's coat, face turned slightly away, expression unreadable. Moats, uneasy, delivered it to the county archive, where it was catalogued and promptly forgotten. During this period, the newly formed Georgia Board of Health began reviewing cases of rural poisonings. In their reports, echoing the same public health documentation preserved in the History of Public Health in Georgia, 1733-1950, they cited several historical incidents of unregulated compounds sold as patent medicine, though none were named directly. A marginal note simply read, "Creek District, case unresolved." That vague phrasing was enough for some to speculate that Wren's formula might have resurfaced under another name. In 1923, a widow in neighboring Monroe County reported receiving a small package by post, containing a corked vial and a folded instruction sheet labeled Elixir No. 7, Restorative Use. She turned it over to the local constable, who sent it to Atlanta for examination. The return envelope was never found. Within weeks, the widow fell ill with symptoms strikingly similar to those recorded at Marrow's Creek years earlier. The attending doctor described her condition as progressive peril. Isis with lucidity intact until the final hour. Her final words, as transcribed by the nurse, were, "He still writes." That phrase puzzled investigators, who assumed delirium. But among the widow's papers, they discovered a short letter penned in a hand matching the old apothecary records. "Your faith sustains my work. Trust the measure. Ignore the cost." The ink had faded, but the signature, an ornate E.W., remained clear. News of this event spread quietly, passed between county officers and ministers, none wishing to alarm the public. Rural superstition still carried weight, and the authorities preferred discretion. Yet for the few who compared these accounts, a pattern emerged. Each new occurrence followed a drought. Each witness described a thin man in outdated attire, and each bottle, regardless of county, bore the same number, 7. The case was never reopened. Officials simply wrote it off as hoax correspondence and moved on. But among field clerks and station masters, the story became a warning told in hushed voices. Beware the parcels without return address, for sometimes the sender remembers what the world prefers to forget. By 1926, the state's attention turned to new industries and modern sanitation, and the name Elias Wren faded from all but a few yellowing ledgers. Yet that same year, a young medical examiner named Thomas Grady stumbled upon a set of unfiled chemical reports stored in a wooden crate at the Milledgeville Archive. Inside were vials sealed with wax, their labels scorched but decipherable. The composition listed morphine, formaldehyde, and an unspecified metallic additive, most likely arsenic sulfide. Grady, meticulous by nature, cross-referenced the handwriting with archived health board letters and noted the initials E.W. scrawled in the corner of each card. In his private journal, later discovered after his death, he wrote, "If these are remnants of the Marrow's Creek mixtures, then the line between medicine and murder was thinner than we were told." His supervisor discouraged further inquiry, noting that the incident was a relic best left to the county historians. But Grady continued quietly, seeking testimonies from surviving families. One elderly man, Samuel Dunworth, recalled his father's dealings with Wren. "He looked like a scholar," Dunworth said, "never raised his voice, just watched you like he was measuring your breath." Those words found their way into a small article in the Augusta Herald under the headline, "Old Tonic Tales Revived." The piece was quickly buried beneath election coverage, but a clipping of it was later cited in a rural folklore pamphlet discussing Georgia's darker medical past. It was during this period that professors compiling the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, gathered field accounts of such stories, mentioning them cautiously as examples of dangerous remedies distributed before modern licensing. Among them was a single-page referencing the Marrow's Creek compound circa 1906, containing ingredients consistent with arsenical tonic formulas. No name, no town, just a shadow in the footnotes. The mention reignited quiet curiosity. Historians debated whether Wren's mixture had been an experiment gone wrong or deliberate malpractice. Some argued that the arsenic served as a preservative, a misguided attempt to extend the medicine's shelf life. Others, reading Grady's journal, believed it was something darker, a form of control, the illusion of healing used to study decay. In 1928, a traveling lecturer from Atlanta's Emory College presented a talk on Georgia's Forgotten Healers. Among his slides was a photograph of a cracked storefront sign, faintly reading "Apothecary." The caption beneath simply said, "Unverified source, possibly Marrow's Creek." Attendees later described the lecturer's unease when questions turned to the missing doctor. He ended the session early, muttering that the archive box he'd received contained one bottle still sealed, the contents oddly fresh. He never presented again. The lecturer's disappearance did not make headlines, but whispers spread through academic circles in Atlanta. Some claimed he had fallen ill soon after the talk, complaining of dizziness and strange trembling in his hands. Others insisted he left the state entirely, unnerved by what he had found. In late 1929, janitors cleaning out a storage room at Emory discovered a small wooden crate marked with faded ink, specimen number 7. Inside were 3 bottles, one broken, one empty, and one perfectly intact. The cork had fused with age, but the liquid inside glimmered darkly under the gaslight. A note attached to the bottle bore a simple instruction: "Do not open." The handwriting matched samples attributed to Dr. Elias Wren, compared years later by historians studying early pharmaceutical fraud in Georgia. By then, the Great Depression had set in, and no one had time for ghost stories of failed doctors. Yet a few archivists kept the file open, quietly adding newspaper clippings and personal correspondences to what became known internally as the Wren Ledger. It was within those pages that a new clue appeared. A letter from a pharmacist in Baton Rouge, dated February 1930, describing a traveling physician selling a nerve elixir identical in formulation to the one banned in Georgia. The man used the alias Dr. E. Wynn. His description matched the aging Wren almost exactly: graying hair, quiet voice, peculiar steadiness of gaze. The Louisiana authorities dismissed the report as coincidence, but the mention reignited old fears among those who remembered the Marrow's Creek tragedy. By 1932, the site of the old apothecary was reduced to rubble, overgrown by creeping vine and wild grass. Locals said that in the summer heat, the ground still gave off a faint smell of alcohol and iron. Farmers avoided it, saying their livestock refused to drink from the creek. One young boy, Natus Cole, grandson of the woman who had unearthed bottles years earlier, claimed to have found an old ledger half buried near the foundation. It contained only numbers, measurements, and 2 sentences written faintly at the bottom. "The work continues. The body adapts." His father burned it before anyone could read further. Meanwhile, the Board of Health, reorganized under federal direction during the New Deal years, re-examined early rural poisoning cases. Their compiled notes cited unidentified compounds sold between 1905 to 1915, resulting in chronic systemic failure. In parentheses beside one entry was written simply MC, unresolved. For most, the letters meant nothing, but to a few in the archives, those initials were unmistakable: Marrow's Creek. Decades of silence could not erase the shape of what had happened. Whether Wren had survived, or whether imitators had carried on his work, no one could say. Yet even now, small-town doctors in rural Georgia still kept an unspoken rule: never sell mixtures unlabeled, and never use the number 7 in any tonic formula. By 1934, the legend of Elias Wren had grown into a kind of medical folklore, whispered among young interns and country physicians. In Macon, a retired nurse named Clara Devens recalled a time when her hospital forbade the use of home-brewed remedies, citing the Creek doctor's ghost as the reason. When asked decades later, she described finding a bottle of dark syrup in a shipment of supplies that bore no manufacturer's mark, only the number 7 scratched faintly into the glass. She threw it away without opening it. Not everyone was so cautious. A small-town pharmacist in Dalton, curious about the recurring stories, claimed to have recreated the original formula based on a description he found in a defunct medical catalog. The mixture, prepared in controlled quantities, reportedly caused violent stomach pain in a single test animal. The pharmacist, shaken, poured the rest into a drainage pit and sealed his notes. He never spoke of it again. Around this time, the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, was being drafted, and a passing reference appeared within its chapter on rural sanitation. Early decades of the century saw unregulated chemical compounding in isolated counties, occasionally resulting in mass poisonings. It did not name Marrow's Creek directly, but those familiar with the archives knew the implication. A young historian named Alfred Penn wrote a letter to the board requesting permission to investigate the matter further. He received a reply 3 weeks later, advising him that the relevant documents had been misplaced during record consolidation. That same summer, Penn traveled to the abandoned county site to see what remained. Locals warned him the ground was unstable, but he spent 3 nights camping by the ruins. His field notes, recovered years later, mentioned hearing faint metallic rattling near the old creek bed, as if bottles roll under the soil when the wind shifted. On his final night he wrote, "The silence here feels aware, not empty." He returned to Atlanta pale and exhausted, speaking little of what he saw. Colleagues said he became withdrawn, his lectures slower, his eyes fixed on some distant thought. In his personal diary, one final entry stood alone. If Wren was searching for immortality, he may have found it, not in himself, but in the sickness that bears his name. After Penn's death in 1939, his papers were sealed at his request. The box was labeled, "Do not review," until 50 years after my passing. When it was finally opened in 1989, archivists found nothing inside but a single scrap of cloth, the kind once used to wipe laboratory glass, and a faint reddish stain that testing could not identify. The decades that followed only deepened the silence around Marrow's Creek. By the early 1940s, new war industries and shifting populations erased many of Georgia's smaller towns from maps, and the creek became one more forgotten dot on old survey charts. Yet in 1942, when the Army Corps of Engineers surveyed rural lands for training fields, a team uncovered the buried foundation of what they described as a narrow brick structure containing chemical residues and scorched glass. A technician on site, Corporal James Maddox, later reported that one bottle was found intact, its label preserved by the soil. No, 7, for nerves and constitution. The bottle was sent to a temporary lab near Augusta, then disappeared from inventory within a week. Maddox kept a personal notebook, later recovered by his family, where he described feeling ill for several days afterward. "I dreamt of a man in a long coat standing behind the creek water," he wrote. He said, "It never stopped working." His account was dismissed as imagination brought on by fatigue. Still, an internal memo from the Department of Health that same year quietly referenced resurfacing of unregulated compounds from early century contamination events. The handwriting beside the typed text read only, "Possible connection to Wren." Those compiling the later history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, noted these fragments carefully but avoided official mention. The post-war years were meant for rebuilding, not reopening ghosts. In 1946, the county acquired the overgrown land for agricultural use. Workers plowed the area, turning up shards of dark glass and pieces of medical instruments rusted to powder. The foreman, Elijah Boone, told his grandson that one field hand had sliced his hand on something buried in the dirt, and within a week became feverish, his skin pale as milk. Doctors diagnosed tetanus, though Boonell Way swore the wound was too small. After that, the men refused to till that section again, calling it the doctor's acre. Over time, the vegetation reclaimed everything. When aerial photographs were taken in 1950 for new highway planning, a faint rectangular outline was visible from above, too straight to be natural. It aligned exactly with the old property coordinates for Wren's apothecary. Those who examined the image said it resembled the impression left by a foundation long since gone, but a shadow ran down the center, darker than the rest, as if the ground itself remembered where the door once stood. The following winter, a local historian hiking through the site reported finding a single object near the creek bank, a glass stopper engraved with the initials EW. He left it where it was. Some relics, he later wrote, prefer to stay buried, because they still have purpose. By 1951, Marrow's Creek existed only as a name in land deeds and fading recollection. A few old-timers still spoke of the doctor, though always in cautious tones, as if mentioning him too clearly might draw something near. One such man, Jacob Lorne, told a journalist from the Atlanta Constitution that he remembered seeing Elias Wren once as a boy, standing by a mule cart with boxes of bottles, like a preacher selling salvation. The journalist dismissed the story, but printed a brief piece titled "The Healer Who Vanished," noting that Wren's disappearance had never been formally closed. The article sparked renewed curiosity among local researchers who scoured archives for any surviving record. A clerk in the state library discovered a weathered ledger listing medicinal licenses revoked in 1907. At the bottom of the page, barely legible, was E. Wren, suspended for malpractice, whereabouts unknown. The ink bled as if it had been damp before drying. That same summer, a severe drought struck the region, and the old creek bed near the ruins dried entirely for the first time in decades. Children exploring the cracked earth found fragments of glass and a corroded tin plate engraved with the number 7. They brought it to the county sheriff, who told them it was junk from a time when men didn't know better. But one of the boys, years later, would write that he never forgot the strange smell rising from that empty creek, something sharp and chemical that burned the throat. In September, a state geologist testing soil samples from the area noted high traces of arsenic consistent with early pharmaceutical use. He filed his report without realizing the location's history. It would be decades before another researcher connected it to the Marrow's Creek case. Meanwhile, the story of the cursed doctor slipped once again into silence. Families who had lived nearby moved on, their myriad descendants scattering to Macon, Savannah, and further north. Yet some still told the tale on cold evenings, a quiet man with calm eyes, selling a syrup that promised life and gave death instead. They said his ghost walked the banks of the dried creek, looking for water to mix his tonic again. Farmers claimed that when the wind blew from the south, the scent of medicine returned faintly in the air, sweet, metallic, and wrong. In 1953, The History of Public Health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, was finally published. Buried in its appendix was a single sentence that scholars still debate. Among the earliest recorded poisonings by unlicensed practitioners remains an unresolved case from the Creek District involving a proprietary tonic of arsenical composition. No names, no locations, only the echo of an old wound in careful academic phrasing. For those who had heard the whispers, though, it was proof that the story was never entirely gone, just waiting beneath the surface for someone to dig too deep. In the years following 1953, a quiet effort emerged among local historians to document the stories that official records avoided. One such historian, Martha Ellery of Milledgeville, took special interest in the Marrow's Creek incident after reviewing the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950. Her notes describe it as a fissure in the moral fabric of rural medicine, where belief and science collided without witness. She began collecting oral testimonies from older residents scattered across the county, many of whom remembered relatives who had fallen ill during that strange winter of 1906. Several recalled seeing the bottles themselves, dark glass, gold lettering, and a faint residue that clung even after washing. One elderly woman, Agnes Shaw, described how her mother used the tonic for fatigue and claimed it burned like a small fire beneath the ribs. Agnes remembered her mother's decline, slow, lucid, and peaceful, as though the sickness itself mimicked healing. Ellery documented these testimonies carefully, comparing them to early pharmaceutical advertisements and shipment records from Savannah's port. Among the invoices, she found one intriguing line: "Delivery to W. Wren Company Medical Goods, 24 cases syrup base." The misspelling, W. Wren, was likely deliberate. What stood out most to Ellery, however, was a recurring pattern in the statements she gathered. People spoke less of Wren as a villain and more as a mystery. Some described him as a man searching for something he could not find. One informant told her he wasn't evil, just too sure of his own light. Another said, he looked at you like he could see your sickness before you could. These details fascinated Ellery. She began to suspect that the man's obsession was not profit but perfection, the idea of a medicine too strong for the human frame. Late in 1954, she requested permission to visit the overgrown remains of the old apothecary site. What she found, she never fully described, but her field notebook ended with a single cryptic entry. The ground breathes here. Days later, she fell ill with an unexplained fever. Her colleagues dismissed it as exhaustion from travel, but she confided to a friend that her dreams were filled with the sound of glass knocking together in water. She recovered, though her health was never the same. Ellery never returned to the site. In her later writings, she referred to Wren as a symptom of his age, a man caught between discovery and delusion. Yet her unpublished manuscript, found decades later, closed on an unsettling line. If the cure still lingers, it may not be his alone anymore. The words trailed off, the ink smudged by what looked like moisture, as though the paper had been damp when she wrote it. After Martha Ellery's passing in 1956, her collected notes were sent to the State University archives, where they sat untouched for decades, their envelopes brittle with time. Only in the 1970s did a graduate student named Leon Carver come across them while researching the development of pharmaceutical ethics in the rural South. Carver described opening one of Ellery's boxes and being struck by the smell, a faint sweetness like old medicine. Inside, he found her field sketches of Marrow's Creek, along with dried plant samples labeled soil residue test. Among her correspondence was a letter addressed to an unnamed recipient that read, I believe something was left behind, not alive but persistent. The soil itself remembers. Carver, fascinated, decided to visit the site himself. What he found was little more than forest and silence. The creek had narrowed to a sluggish ribbon of dark water, its banks swallowed by vines. Yet he wrote later that, beneath the earth, the glass still waits. His report included photographs of several partially unearthed bottles, identical in shape to early 20th century apothecary glass. None bore legible labels, but one still carried the faint imprint of a number, 7. Carver sealed the finds and sent them for analysis to a university chemistry department. The results were inconclusive. Traces of organic compounds remained, but the chemical structure had degraded beyond identification. When Carver presented his findings, his advisor cautioned him to avoid romanticizing the story. Yet the datasheet revealed something curious, an abnormally high level of arsenic and morphine residue consistent with early tonics used in rural Georgia between 1900 and 1910. The timeline fit too perfectly to dismiss. Carver's published paper, though academic in tone, reopened interest in Wren's legend. Newspapers dubbed it the Devil's Doctor case, while Locus. All television ran brief segments showing the old photographs. Within months, collectors began visiting the site, digging for relics. A few claimed to have found fragments of dark glass or rusted instruments, but others reported stranger things. One photographer insisted he heard faint clinking sounds while taking long exposures near the creek. Another said that through his camera lens, he saw a figure standing inside the ruins, though none appeared in the developed image. Skeptics called it superstition. Still, the renewed attention led to the county fencing off the area in 1979, citing contamination risks. Carver himself visited one last time that year. His final journal entry before leaving Georgia read simply, he wasn't chasing death, he was measuring it. The meaning remains uncertain, but those words have since appeared carved into a wooden sign left anonymously near the overgrown trail leading to what locals still call the Doctor's Acre. By the early 1980s, the site once known as Marrow's Creek had become a quiet destination for the curious and the reckless. Teenagers dared each other to sneak past the county's fence after dark, their flashlights slicing through humid air thick with the scent of soil and stagnant water. Many of them returned laughing, clutching nothing but broken glass and old bottle caps. Yet a few spoke of odd sensations, of feeling watched, of hearing faint footsteps where no one stood. One boy, Jason Miles, claimed that when his light swept across the collapsed foundation, the beam reflected off something round and clear, like a pair of eyes in the dark. He fled before looking closer. When sheriff's deputies later found his dropped flashlight, its lens was smeared with an oily film that burned when touched. No samples were kept. The incident stirred talk again in nearby towns, enough for a reporter from the Macon Telegraph to revisit the legend in a weekend feature titled "The Doctor Who Wouldn't Die." It summarized the history from the 1906 poisonings to Leon Carver's rediscovery and hinted at contamination still lingering underground. The article quoted one retired health official as saying, "We never proved it was poison in the soil, but we never proved it wasn't either." When the piece ran, locals flooded the paper with letters, some dismissing the tale, others sharing half-remembered stories from grandparents who had known of the man with the vials. One letter, unsigned, simply read, "He was my grandfather. He only wanted to heal." The editorial staff dismissed it as a prank, though the handwriting was neat and old-fashioned, written in fountain ink. That same week, a small chemical spill near the Ocmulgee River drew environmental inspectors to the area. In their report, they noted finding traces of arsenic and formaldehyde in soil samples near the creek perimeter, though no industrial sources were nearby. The official explanation cited historical contamination from agricultural compounds. Yet one inspector, privately interviewed years later, swore the smell reminded him of the hospital cabinets my grandmother used to lock. Even as the county posted new warning signs and restricted access, stories continued to circulate of ghostly lights, of figures glimpsed between trees, and of a whisper that sometimes rose from the creek when the wind was still. It was around this time that a local history professor, Judith Harland, began compiling what she called the Wren Dossier, a collection of all known references, letters, and photographs tied to the case. In her introduction she wrote, "If memory has a scent, then this one smells of metal and rain." Her research would later become the most comprehensive account of the legend, though even she admitted the deeper she looked, the less she could tell where the man ended and the myth began. Professor Judith Harlan's project became an obsession that stretched through most of the 1980s. She traveled across Georgia, interviewing descendants of anyone remotely linked to the 1906 poisonings, compiling audio tapes labeled by county and date. Her tone in those recordings was calm, professional, but her questions hinted at unease. "Do you recall anything strange about the creek's smell?" Or, "Was there ever talk of glass found in your family's land?" Some of the interviewees answered plainly, describing the place as cursed or empty, but a few provided chillingly specific recollections. One man from Monroe County recalled his grandmother warning children not to play near the doctor's shadow. Another woman, age 93, said her father once found a box of bottles in their barn labeled with a faded number 7. "He threw them in the fire," she said. "The smoke turned green." Harlan verified none of this, but she noted that each storyteller spoke as though describing something recently remembered, not inherited legend. Her manuscript drafts, now preserved in the university library, suggest that she began to connect the events to a broader cultural fear of unregulated medicine and blind trust in authority. Yet her tone shifted halfway through. In one margin she scribbled, "There is a pattern of recurrence, every 20 to 25 years, following drought." When a journalist later asked her about that note, she refused to elaborate, saying only, "Some stories cycle because the ground lets them." By 1987, Harlan's health had declined. She stopped giving lectures and limited contact with her students. A colleague who visited her home claimed that all the windows were covered and the air smelled faintly of alcohol and old paper. On her desk sat a single bottle of dark glass, empty, with a label reading, "Exhibit, do not open." No record exists of where she obtained. Edit. After her death in 1989, her nephew donated the bottle and her papers to the State Historical Society. During cataloging, an archivist accidentally dropped the bottle, shattering it on the floor. Staff described a sharp odor filling the room that lingered for days. Testing revealed nothing toxic, just residue consistent with aged alcohol and iron oxide, But one employee who handled the fragments developed a rash that lasted weeks. The incident was logged quietly under collection safety. Though Harlan's book was never published, her collected notes became the basis for several documentaries and podcasts in the decades that followed. Each retelling added or lost details, but all agreed on one thing. No matter how much the story was studied, it resisted resolution. Every attempt to explain it seemed to loop back into uncertainty, as if the truth itself had been diluted, bottled, and mislabeled long ago. By the mid-1990s, interest in Dr. Wren's story returned once again, this time through the lens of environmental science. A research team from the University of Georgia conducted a soil contamination survey across several forgotten industrial sites, and one of their sampling grids overlapped the area once known as Marrow's Creek. The official purpose was agricultural, testing runoff content and heavy metal distribution, but in the final report, buried among charts and tables, a single note stood out. Sample MC07 displays abnormal chemical retention inconsistent with natural decay. Odor described as medicinal. The coincidence of that numbering, MC07, was enough to reignite whispers among archivists familiar with the legend. The field supervisor, Dr. Alan Pierce, later admitted that when he took the sample, he had no idea of the site's history. He described feeling uneasy that day, saying the ground looked as if it had been recently disturbed, though the instruments showed no trace of digging. His assistant joked that maybe the cursed doctor was still brewing underground. The remark made it into Pierce's field log, circled and underlined as if he regretted writing it. When the data were published, an anonymous letter arrived at the department typed on yellowed paper. The formula remains perfect. The earth remembers the measure. It bore no signature, only the initials, EW. Investigators traced the postmark to a small town in southern Georgia, but found nothing more. The local postmaster claimed the envelope had been dropped into the slot late at night, sealed with wax. The university dismissed the incident as a hoax. Still, several staff members involved in the survey reported recurring headaches and metallic tastes for weeks afterward, though lab tests showed no exposure to toxins. One technician swore she heard glass clinking in her sample cooler, even when it was empty. The events never reached the press, but within academic circles the phrase Marrow's sample became shorthand for research that attracted trouble. A decade later, Pierce would recall the site in an interview. It wasn't haunted, just wrong. The soil felt alive, like it wanted to breathe through you. Around the same time, local folklore groups began posting stories online about the Doctor of Seven, describing him as a restless figure who roamed the creek at night searching for lost vials. Most of those stories were fiction, yet one anonymous poster shared a photograph supposedly taken near the site. It showed an old apothecary bottle, half buried in clay, still corked. On its neck, faint but visible, were the etched letters WREN. The image was never authenticated, and when investigators returned to the spot, the bottle was gone. Only a shallow impression remained, perfectly round, as if the earth had swallowed it back. As the 21st century began, Marrow's Creek was little more than a myth threaded through digital forums and late-night radio shows. Yet in 2003, a small restoration project funded by the County Historical Society sought to catalog forgotten towns erased by early 1900s maps. When their field team reached the coordinates for the creek, they found only a depression filled with stagnant water and pine roots. Project leader Dana Corbin noted in her report that compass readings fluctuated wildly and that photographs taken near the site developed with strange light streaks. It was like the camera picked up reflections that weren't there, she wrote. During excavation of what appeared to be an old drainage trench, workers uncovered fragments of a wooden crate and several shards of dark glass bearing partial lettering, IC number 7. They halted digging immediately, and environmental safety officers tested the soil, confirming low traces of arsenic and morphine, the same compounds recorded in the earliest health board documents now cited in the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950. The discovery should have sparked scientific interest, yet official agencies declined further involvement, citing liability concerns. The fragments were sealed in airtight containers and transferred to storage, though their current location is unknown. Corbin, interviewed years later, confessed that what troubled her most was not the glass, but the smell that rose when they unearthed it. It was sweet, like syrup, and it came from soil that hadn't seen light in 100 years. Afterward, several crew members reported recurring dreams involving water and mirrors. One claimed to see a man's face reflected in the creek whenever he closed his eyes. A man expressionless, with normal human eyes but surrounded by darkness. The team dismissed it as suggestion, but by autumn, the county terminated the restoration entirely, leaving the site to the woods once again. That winter, locals found fresh footprints leading toward the creek and ending abruptly at the waterline. No one claimed them. A hunter named Reed Mallory later said he saw a flicker of light deep within the trees, like a lantern swinging slow, then stopping. He called out but received no reply, only the faint echo of clinking glass carried by the cold air. When he returned with others the next morning, they found nothing but disturbed mud and a single wooden marker driven into the ground. Carved into its surface were two characters, E.W. The wood was new. Mallory moved away soon after, telling neighbors he had heard something breathing that wasn't wind. To this day, the area remains closed to visitors, though the warning signs are weathered and the fence long fallen. The creek flows quietly beneath them, dark and shallow, reflecting nothing. In 2008, a small independent filmmaker named Caleb Royston began shooting a short documentary about lost towns in Georgia. He included Marrow's Creek only as a curiosity, an example of how myths grew around forgotten places. But the deeper he researched, the less it felt like myth. He interviewed elderly residents in nearby counties, one of whom produced an heirloom bottle passed down from her grandmother. The glass was dark amber, its surface bubbled with age, and across its belly, faintly etched, were the letters N7. Royston filmed the interview, but later removed the footage, claiming the woman's health deteriorated soon after. In a later statement, he said, "The bottle seemed to change color under light, at first brown, then red." He stored it in a padded case and sent it to a prop archivist in Atlanta, but the courier never delivered it. The parcel tracking ended near Macon. Weeks later, the courier company received a complaint from an unknown sender. The package has returned to its maker. Royston pressed on, visiting the site with a small crew. They filmed at dusk, capturing the faint outline of the creek and the remains of the apothecary foundation. Audio logs from that night recorded the sound of running water, followed by a single clink, glass against glass, though no bottles were present. The following morning, the crew found one of their cameras tilted toward the creek. Its last frame showed ripples forming in still water, though the air had been calm. Production halted soon after. Royston later described feeling a pressure, like standing too close to a furnace. In post-production, he tried restoring the footage but found every attempt distorted by faint vertical lines, as if the image itself resisted exposure. The film, titled The Cursed Doctor, premiered in a small Atlanta theater, but was pulled after its first screening when the projector overheated and burned the final reel. Audiences who saw it described an ordinary historical documentary until the last minute, when the narrator's voice faded and a different whisper, not recorded by Royston, emerged on the soundtrack. It said, "Measure the dose." The surviving crew denied adding it. The reel was stored in a fireproof vault at the production company's office, but months later, a water leak damaged the storage room. All that remained of the film was a warped strip of celluloid showing the creek's reflection at night. Even today, archivists who've handled that piece report a faint, medicinal odor, like syrup and iron. Royston stopped making documentaries after that. When asked years later if he believed in the legend, he answered, "I don't, but I believe the earth can remember what we've done to it." By the 2010s, Marrow's Creek had turned into a footnote of internet folklore, a story cited in blogs and amateur ghost hunting videos, each retelling slightly different, but all orbiting the same core: the vanished doctor, the toxic tonic, the number 7. In 2014, a group of graduate students from Savannah College of Art and Design visited the site for a thesis project on forgotten Southern myths. They carried electromagnetic scanners, audio recorders, and high-resolution cameras, determined to capture something tangible. The footage they returned with was uneventful: mud, trees, the glint of water. But in the background of several frames, faint light distortions hovered near the spot where Wren's apothecary once stood. At first they assumed it was lens flare. But one student, reviewing the footage at slow speed, noticed the pattern of the flickers resembled heartbeat pulses. She overlaid the data with an audio waveform of the creek's running water and found the rhythm aligned almost perfectly. The team released their findings online, calling it residual pulse phenomenon, though many dismissed it as an editing trick. Around that same time, an anonymous email reached their university account from an address composed only of numbers. It read, "The formula endures because belief preserves it. Leave the soil to its silence." Attached was a photograph of a glass vial, half filled with dark liquid, labeled simply Number 7. Digital analysis confirmed the image's metadata, placed it within 5 miles of Marrow's Creek, dated 2 days before the student's visit. Authorities traced nothing. The land had since reverted to private ownership, and the new owner, an agricultural developer, fenced off the area again, citing contamination and safety risks. However, county inspectors found no active chemicals, only an unusually high mineral density in the creek's sediment: iron, sulfur, and trace morphine derivatives that should not have persisted after a century. When asked about the findings, one inspector said quietly, "The water smells like something that used to be alive." The report was filed, sealed, and archived. In online forums, speculation grew that someone had recreated Wren's formula, perhaps using fragments of his old notes. Others claimed it was never a poison at all, but an experimental preservative that had infected the ground itself. A skeptic summarized it best. "There was never a curse, only persistence. The doctor never died. His work just stopped aging." In 2017, a passing storm uprooted several trees near the creek. Photographs taken by local hikers showed what appeared to be a sunken structure beneath the mud, brick, symmetrical, and too deliberate to be natural. Within days, county crews filled the depression with soil. No excavation followed, and official statements said erosion had created visual illusions. But a single aerial photo remained, archived anonymously online. It showed a perfect rectangle of dark ground, its outline forming the shape of a narrow building, door facing north toward the water. Today, nothing remains of Marrow's Creek on official maps. The road leading there ends abruptly in a tangle of pine and kudzu, and the creek itself has been reduced to a thin, slow ribbon beneath the weeds. Locals say it isn't silent. It hums faintly at night, a low vibration just above hearing. Environmental agencies list the site as neutral, yet warnings still stand on rusted poles. No fishing, no drinking water use. Those who live nearby swear the signs are replaced every few years, though no one ever sees who does it. In 2020, a historical podcast revisited the story, combining excerpts from the history of public health in Georgia, 1733 to 1950, with witness accounts. Their narrator described Wren as a man lost to his own medicine, a physician undone by the illusion of cure. Listeners flooded the show's forums with messages. Some shared photographs of the creek, others sent strange recordings, soft tapping sounds, faint liquid movement, and one clip of a whisper repeating the same phrase, "Still works." Experts dismissed the audio as staged interference, but one listener, a retired chemist living near the Okmulgee River, analyzed the file's background noise and noted that it carried the same frequency as glass resonating underwater. When she sent her results to the producers, the email bounced back as undeliverable. The podcast ended its series shortly after. Even now, the legend refuses rest. Occasional hikers report finding bits of brown glass pressed into the soil, smooth and unbroken, or footprints leading nowhere near the water's edge. On humid nights, the air thickens with a smell faintly medicinal, sweet at first, then metallic. Some swear it fades if you stop breathing for a moment, as though the air itself is waiting. The old maps show where the apothecary once stood, And when overlaid with modern surveys, that same outline still matches a shallow depression, hidden beneath ivy and roots. Scholars continue to debate what truly happened in 1906, whether Elias Wren was a misguided healer, a fraud, or a man who glimpsed some border of science he could not control. But the people of Georgia have their own verdict. They say the creek took his soul, trading water for his work. That every few decades, when the droughts return and the ground cracks open, the smell of his tonic rises again, and those who breathe too deeply feel their hearts slow just enough to hear the sound of glass knocking softly under the earth. No one digs there anymore. The records end quietly, the way the water does, disappearing beneath the roots, never gone, just waiting.